We are live now. Okay. So thanks a lot, Bob, for
Abhineet, thank you.
yes. So Robert, I think Robert Weibel, you are a founder and CEO of CENAD with Brussels. You have done over 2,000 consultancies for over 100 government agencies, 90% of all the countries in the world. And you focus a lot on different topics related to negotiation, mediation, conflict resolution, diplomacy, crisis management. And having worked with so many different agencies for UN, all abbreviations you have worked with at EU level with private companies, I really wanted to thank you for being here today to talk about how does COVID impact the whole concept of international negotiation, right? So let us get straight to the point about what does the lack of physical meeting mean for international negotiation? Uh, what does it really mean? How does it change the dynamics? And what are some of the skills which the negotiators need to build upon in this time?
Okay, well, that's a that's a fundamental question here. I think we have to say that the biggest change that working remotely is going to have is namely the fact that the intimacy and the trust which negotiators need to develop between themselves, but also with regards to the process, this has been literally thrown out of the window. If the individuals involved negotiating and meeting remotely, if they already have a working relationship, if they've managed different issues in the past, then of course the trust factor will be by definition higher. The difficulty is for strangers to come together. And that, of course, is also related to the fact that, we talk about meetings, but we have to distinguish between meetings and negotiations. We're having a meeting now, but we're not negotiating. You have numerous meetings which are exchanges of information, clarification of positions or whatever. But to a large extent, if we're going to get to the nitty-gritty where the parties need to make the big, take the risk of actually close some sort of an agreement, then I would say, roughly speaking, that the, COVID has, and this is going to last probably another 2 years. That's my gut feeling. This is going to have a large impact on the process of negotiation, for sure, and it's going to impact, how people operate and what they need to do. Would you like me to continue on this? Because it's clear that preparation is going to be key.
Correct. Yes. So how do you prepare for something like this? Because it's not something which is from the standard negotiation textbooks. So how do you prepare for something which is an event where nobody has prepared for? So how do you prepare for that when you are an international negotiator?
Well, I mean, the skills remain the same. There are three pillars, so to speak, and they can also, spill over and be horizontal. But you have the interpersonal aspect. That, of course, is the one which is the most severely impacted by definition. We have the communication dimension. And certainly one of the elements when you're negotiating, and that's also linked to the trust factor that I was mentioning before, is my discussion with you confidential? We're on YouTube now. I'm clearly not going to give you any confidential information by definition. So there is that aspect here. There's also the fact that we work in plenary. Are we going to have some sort of a Zoom type of network? If we're 20 people on the screen, that's one thing. If we're 2 people, if we're 300 people, that changes completely. And of course, the third big pillar. So we have the interpersonal skills, the communication skills, but of course the analytical skills. So all of these things, all of these skills, they will continue. It's how we implement them. And for example, what do we need to analyze? Is the context going to be something that has to be taken into account? Also the fact that are we at the beginning of our process? Are we in the middle? Are we in the closing phase? Also key to understand who is actually quote unquote negotiating. Yeah. Because we talk about ministers. I think it's not a world secret to say that ministers don't do the negotiating. True. Right? Yeah. They put the cherry on the cake. But it's civil servants, it's diplomats, it's private sector. In other words, all of the different stakeholders, all of the different actors in the negotiation process, they will intervene at different levels. Now, if all of those different levels also go remote, then obviously it's going to take much longer. I have been working remotely now for about 2 months. I have to say that I'm pleasantly surprised by how well things go,
Yeah.
but it just takes longer. It
Correct.
simply takes longer. It's a little bit like actually working and having consecutive interpretation. So you have to limit your phrases, which I'm not doing now. You have to limit it to 9 words, and then your interpreter comes in and whispers to whoever it is that you're talking to.
Sure.
And so there's almost like an echo. It just takes longer.
Sure.
And so obviously in those circumstances, there's enormous potential for misunderstanding. So we then have to be much more careful. We have to ask for clarification. We have to reformulate. Have I understood correctly? We will also continue by exchanging written documentation. So, for example, the meetings that I engage in, for example, are a blend of WhatsApp with Zoom, with just regular phone calls and sending emails and what have you. So, in fact, the negotiators today will have to be very creative, not so much in the final agreement, putting the package together, but there will be huge creativity available for how do we manage the discussion, how do we get information across, how do we understand and distinguish between what people are claiming they want with what they actually need.
Sure.
And so it's all of these things which are clearly going to come together. But we will still need to have agendas. We will still need to have procedures in terms of how do we decide. If it's bilateral, it's consensus. If it's multi-party, are we going to vote? Do we still want consensus? Is it simply agreement by silence? Nobody is objecting. All of these elements will again need to be highlighted because there is no business as usual, hence unusual. So we almost have to go back and be very clear with each other. How are we going to manage this process? How are we going to, for example, exchange information? Are there going to be rules, a code of conduct in terms of confidentiality? Or is somebody immediately going to plaster this in a tweet? And again, we keep coming back to the whole problem of trust, confidence between the parties, but also confidence in, let's say, the management of the process itself.
Agreed. Understand. And I think that is an important point because, I mean, when you look at the situation right now, you are effectively on a cloud-based solutions. The trust factor becoming very important, not only between the two parties, but also between the system or the channel you are using as well. And you also mentioned about that you feel that there might be a bit of delay. The whole process will become more delayed. So that was actually an important question, or the next question from my side about when we talk about the physical limitations has gone away, you don't really need to physically travel from one country to another to do negotiation or look at a third country, a neutral venue. So obviously there are advantages as well. So how do you see that whole situation? Do you think the process will speed up, or do you think the process will still continue to, or maybe it will become slower than what it was earlier?
Well, I mean, you know my answer already, which is going to be it depends.
Yeah.
And it depends on all sorts of variables, right?
Yeah.
When we talk about international negotiators, again, especially between large organizations and governments, let's be honest, the real negotiation, the tough negotiation, is mostly internal. So then your question would be, okay, within, for example, ministries or interministerial, right? Do they need to manage their discussions remotely as well, right? So, I mean, if you take trade issues, it's not just one ministry. There's going to be all sorts of consultations that need to take place.
Correct.
And so there is actually a system of ongoing simultaneous negotiations which need to feed into each other.
Correct.
And then, of course, you'll need some sort of a political decision at some stage. We'll be talking about, again, we have to agree, what are the red lines? And by the way, again, everybody's using the word red lines today.
Yeah.
Does it mean it's non-negotiable, or does it mean it's a priority? If it's a non-negotiable and you give in, you've lost. But if it's a priority, it's a different story. How do we distinguish between the two? And so again, the difficulty, as always, will be to distinguish what people are telling you in your face, literally, and what is truly fundamentally important for them. And that goes back to, let's call it the spirit of this negotiation. Or do we truly want to have a win-win negotiation? I recently heard somebody saying that this person was not interested in having a balanced outcome. So that means we have to be winners now. Okay, fine. But what is the definition of winning? And it's also clear that because there are so many different elements which need to be packaged together, hopefully they will be valued differently by the parties for completely different reasons. Then we can come up with an attractive package. But the problem then continues selling it back to the constituencies. So have we hyped it up to an extent that, we need to be victorious, whatever that means? And if we look at political negotiations, if we look at trade negotiations, does anybody know what international trade is actually going to look like in even 3 months? Nobody has a clue.
Yes.
So when you negotiate, you're in a joint decision-making environment. You're making commitments. You're thinking, in fact, you're into change management. You're projecting into the future. But what is that future going to be? How does our agreement fit into this future, whatever it's going to be? So I'm a bit dubious about coming up with all sorts of new frameworks and new agreements. What I think the first thing that needs to be done is to develop new ways of working trustfully and confidentially with the party, but with the understanding that today, through social media and what have you, there is so much information which is flying around the world. And so you're never really sure, who is the real audience for this? Are you speaking to your base? Are you speaking to your constituency? Are you trying to, hype it up? Do you want to lower expectations? Do you want to show how tough you are? All of these things are possibilities. And at the end of the day, the negotiator has to figure out how to read all of these signals in the correct manner. And that is going to be the challenge. So it's clear that if we only work screen to screen and we can no longer be face to face, well, we're going to have to find other ways of actually telling each other the truth. And that very often was done walking down the corridor together. Well, now we can't walk down corridors together. So do we need a secure line? But we all know anything electronic is open to somebody. So to me, that is an impediment. If we have to come up with politically sensitive solutions. And by the way, you can be talking about a very technical issue, but the politics will always come to the surface when we start looking at implementation. What needs to be done? By whom? How does it work out? Right? And will the result be, let's say, positive or advantageous?
True. No, I was talking to some diplomats, and one of the common concern was that you cannot focus. There are too many distractions. Unlike when you are physically meeting each other, you have an agenda, you stick to that agenda. But when you are in the world of online, especially if everybody is separate in their own environment, there's a lot of distraction which hinders the process. And that's why I think it's an important point. You also talked a very important point about the future, which we don't even know about. So when you are going to do trade negotiation, you have no idea how trade will look like 3 months, 5 months, a year, 2 years down the line. Similarly, when you talk about peace negotiations, they are a totally different ballgame, if you put it that way. So this whole impact, and we are seeing a lot of confidence building measures happening in peace building or peace agreements, where we are talking about ceasefires. On the trade side, US and UK started their trade negotiation last week. EU and UK are supposed to start something today. So how do you see this, the differences between the different types of negotiations, between trade negotiation versus, let's say the peace building negotiation? Does this impact everybody in the same manner, or does it impact everybody differently?
No, obviously they're very different, but just maybe a comment on what you said. Announcing the beginning of a process is the easy part.
Yes.
Right? Let's be clear. I mean, you and I, we can announce all sorts of things. If we look at all sorts of a number of ceasefires in war zones around the country, you have to ask yourself, why was the ceasefire agreed to? Because at the very beginning of COVID, some people were saying, well, this will weaken the enemy. And then it was like, wait a minute, this might hurt us, right? So the real motivation for the ceasefire was to try to get an understanding, how will COVID impact us, and how? And if it does, do we have the resources to not make it a game changer? It's also the same thing with climate change. I mean, there are people who are looking at climate change as a disaster, and other people who will welcome it because we have new access to this and we have access to that. So again, it's going to, surprise, surprise, depend where you're coming from. But I mean, the whole question of the ceasefires, we all know that a very short military engagement will cost too many thousands of dollars. So I have no idea how lines, supply lines are being impacted by COVID. I don't know whether ammunition is available. This could be very practical reasons. And the whole question of agreeing to a ceasefire, it's not only to evacuate the wounded, it's not only to create a humanitarian corridor so we can get innocent civilians away from wherever the fighting would be, but there's all sorts of other calculations on the part of the belligerents. Now, if we talk about trade negotiations, it's clear this is, COVID is the worst possible thing that could have happened to trying to engineer new trade relations with all of the uncertainty that we have. And I personally, and this is only a personal feeling, I think a lot of people are just asking themselves, do we really need a deal? I mean, the fallback position is WTO rules.
Correct.
Okay? So it's not as if it's the end of the world. It's not as if everything collapses in terms of rules. Maybe things are collapsing for other reasons, but in terms of trade rules. Yep. So maybe we go back to the Stone Age or something like that. But then, so there is that fallback position, whether you call it a BATNA, whatever you want to call it. It's clear. And I'm sure some people are saying, well, maybe that is actually preferable to taking the risk of engaging and redefining something with an erstwhile trading partner, because again, we have to sell it back to our constituencies. We've made all sorts of promises. And we all know that deadlines can be used as leverage, okay? Who is going to blink first? But then just consider, I mean, if there is no trade deal, is it necessarily the end of the world when supply lines are being completely, I don't want to say amputated, but have been ruptured, where many people are now talking about trying to repatriate production capacity? How does that work? I don't know. And I don't think anybody does, frankly. And if you do, I'd like to know who you are, and I would like to work for you.
Okay. Yes, sure. I think these are some very important questions. I think, and there are a lot of factors which are impacting how you take care of these different modalities as well. Another aspect would be about Brexit, and a lot of people are talking about, a lot of people are interested, and there is a hard, as of now at least, a hard line of 31st December 2020. The Brexit has to happen by December 31. So what does COVID mean for Brexit then? What are your perceptions? What are your feedback on the entire process there?
Well, clearly, if you take complex economies, the EU on one side, the UK on the other, with a lot of people in the background, waiting to see what happens. I mean, the UK and the US, obviously, that discussion, is it meant to put pressure on the negotiation with the EU? But then the US Chamber of Commerce says, no, we can't do anything substantive until there's clarification between the UK and the EU. It depends to what degree of closure you want to have by the 31st of December. I mean, we've recently seen that we can declare phase 1 is completed on the 31st of December. Congratulations, we've kept our word. But what is contained within phase 1, or whatever you're going to call it? And let's be clear, these are highly, highly technical issues. This is not going to be Mr. Barnier and Mr. Johnson having a discussion face to face. By the way, the one thing they both have in common, they both survived coronavirus.
Exactly.
So maybe that can create some sort of a human link between them. But they're not the ones, certainly not, to a large extent, these are technical people dealing with very specific files, dealing with things that, frankly, I probably, and most people on the planet, have no clear understanding of what exactly it means, because it is so highly technical. And that's why you're going to have this these sediments, these layers of different types of negotiations that need to be concluded, then take elements either agreed to, which take the elevator upstairs. They might need to be escalated because they need some political guidance. And all of this is going to be part of an internal as well as an internal multilateral environment in what would appear to be a bilateral agreement. So it is already an incredibly complex multi-party negotiation with, again, hundreds, if not thousands, of negotiators. People whose job it is to try to influence a particular type of outcome at their particular level, and then trying to get a sense whether whatever is achieved at their level is going to travel to the top and maybe be part of the so-called final deal. So there's already negotiation is by definition managing huge uncertainty. And COVID has further complicated that simply because none of us are experts in negotiating remotely, right? Taking the floor in a room, the persuasive capabilities, whether you do it remotely or whether you do it with colleagues, is different. But here again, remember, you and I can convince each other, terrific, but then whatever we agree to has to be sold back to those constituencies. And that's why trade negotiations and international negotiations take time, because there's constantly a shuttling between the negotiators, their constituencies, and their constituencies are, again, very often in disagreement with each other. I mean, you were talking about Brexit. I think it's fair to say that, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, there was great uncertainty on how to interpret what appeared to be an unclear British position. Was it a very clever tactic, or was it the fact that there was no consensus internally? And so how do you read that? How do you understand it correctly? So negotiators have always been trying to differentiate interpretation and trying to discover the truth. Now, that task remains, but it has become, it's become a bit more complicated simply because none of us are 100% at ease in terms of deciphering the signals and the different messages that we get. And I'm certainly not saying that having a Zoom conference with 1 million people is the way to do it. I mean, negotiation requires some confidentiality, right? So if you want to have some sort of a bedroom type of gathering, where everybody is peeking in through the windows, that is, in fact, that will act as a hindrance to conclusion. Because anybody who doesn't like what they're seeing or hearing, now today it's so easy for one person to make an incredible amount of noise.
True.
So if anything, it's a complication. And if you're that negotiator, and if you don't want your inbox to be completely polluted with people who call you all sorts of undiplomatic names, you need to be careful. So the negotiation process goes, well, I can't say, underground, because there is no ground anymore. Do we have to come up with some very preferential lines of remote communication? Do we have to go through the good old days where, we will contact our mission or our embassy or our office, and somehow do individuals have face-to-face or some sort of a working relationship? And can we trust with whatever we're hearing or seeing? Question mark.
Yes, true.
There are more questions than answers.
Yes. I think the only good thing I would believe is that you can mute the person you don't like. So that's the only good thing right now you can do. So one question which we have received online is about if you have to choose between all the hottest negotiations happening between countries right now, which one would it be and why?
Okay, you have to repeat that question for me. I'm not sure I got it correctly.
So if you have to choose between the hottest negotiations at the moment between countries, which one would it be and why?
Well, I mean, I can think of several. If we can see at regional levels, for example, simply the management of COVID, right? So we talk about hotspots, so maybe that's a definition of hot. We can see that within the EU, for example, obviously the member states, but with the institutions, They need to come to some common understanding. I mean, the EU budget for the next 7 years is not a closed issue yet. So that is international. We certainly have. I'm not aware of exactly what types of discussions are taking place between the US and between China, for example. Yeah. So in terms of the whole definition of hot, I think that there are many issues that require attention. But I would say that in today's environment, and with COVID especially, we don't have the luxury of time anymore. You know, the law of the sea negotiations lasted 25 years. I hope that the ongoing negotiations, wherever they are not going to be lasting for another 25 years. So on one hand, if you look at our beneficiaries, and that's, you know, that's humanitarian language, but whoever it is that we represent, our constituencies, there is urgent need to come up with workable, politically acceptable solutions, negotiated outcomes, that, given the uncertainty of the real world, the physical world, or whatever we want to call it, also need to have a capacity to correct themselves or tweak themselves, not twit, but tweak themselves, in order to adjust and adapt to circumstance. And this goes back to the spirit of negotiation. Again, anybody can meet. If you want to negotiate, we have to recognize neither one of us can find a solution unilaterally. So we need to do it together. So there is a sense also of solidarity between the negotiators who realize we are dependent on each other. All right. So A, how do we do it? B, what exactly are we talking about? And whatever is agreed to, the test is always implementation. And are the people implementing? Are their concerns actually being represented in these virtual negotiations? All right. So we have to look at the end of the food chain, because if anything has been striking over the last 2 months or 3 months or since the beginning of the year, I mean, we talk about heroes. Okay. These are, you know, Mr. and Mrs. everybody. It's not so much the ministers and the superstars. All right. Yeah. I mean, who cares about Instagram influencers? Somebody's going to attack me, I'm sure. But, you know, even football players, I mean, is somebody worth millions and millions and millions? They can't even play anymore. True. So here again, this is part of the rejuggling. Will it have a long-term effect? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows.
Yes. Right? Yeah. So I think my final question to you would be about, from a private sector perspective, how do you think it impacts the negotiation between companies at a private sector level?
Well, if it's internal to the company, I think they already have a track record of managing remote. But if you're dealing between companies, if it is, you know, if it's pure sales, you see, here again, it depends. What are the differences of positions, all right? And are the interests? It's clear that there's a risk factor when you are in the private sector, because one mistake and you're out of business. If you are a country, you can make some mistakes, but you won't hopefully disappear quickly. Yeah. So this is also where we have in the private sector, I think that because the negotiations tend to be, if you like, more quantifiable, then it is perhaps easier to actually deal with the issues and come to some sort of let's say, to some sort of an understanding. And it is also, I mean, you're dealing with the real world, but here again, the uncertainties that we've just been talking about, supply lines, about getting raw materials and so on and so forth. All right. Sure. That's a question. So you and I can have a deal, but will it work when it comes to delivery? Will there be difficulties at customs? And then we talk about the trade negotiation. Now, are things held up at customs because of health reasons? Is it a non-tariff barrier to trade? Who knows? Who knows? So we are actually in the process, and we will need to negotiate all sorts of codes of conduct. What is acceptable behavior, both in terms of how we do it when it comes to negotiation, but certainly when it comes to implementation.
Sure. So thanks a lot, Bob. I think it's been really good talking to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for your very candid feedback and candid insights about the whole process of how COVID is going to impact how we are going to, you know, as you mentioned, it's going to be the next 2 years we are looking at. So how we are going to survive during these 2 years when we
thrive.
Thrive. Yes, thrive and resiliency. I think you talked about resiliency as well. So thanks, Bob. Thanks for your time, and have a great day ahead. Thank you.
And same to you and everybody who's listening in. Thank you very much.
Thank you.